Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our special event today, How to Stay Emotionally and Psychologically Safe in the Midst of Distressing Media. My name is Andrea Webber, and today we're recording live from the Sensitive Empowerment Community, which offers a positive alternative to social media for sensitive people. And you can find us at sensitivecommunity.com. Now, joining me here today is Dr. Melanie Joy, who holds a PhD in psychology and specialises in relationships, communication, and the psychology of social change. Melanie is a best-selling author and has received a number of awards for her work on global non-violence, including the Ahimsa Award that has previously been given to the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela. Now, Melanie gives talks and trainings in over 60 countries and is the founding president of the international organisation Beyond Carnism. Welcome, Melanie. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. And now some people might be quite familiar with your work, but for those who aren't, it'd be great if you could share a little about your background and the work that you do.
Yeah, certainly. It was really my work in, as you described when you introduced me, I do work on global nonviolence fairly broadly, but it's really been my work in animal protection, promoting compassion for animals that led me to realize the need to open up a conversation about how sensitive people could stay emotionally safe in the midst of distressing media and also be proactive in helping end the violence that media is reflecting. And as a sensitive person myself, a highly sensitive person, and Julie's website actually helped me realize that I'm not just a highly sensitive person, but I'm a highly, highly, highly sensitive person who's really dedicated my entire life to helping to end global or reduce global violence. It's been just striking to me how challenging this conversation is to have with the very people who need to hear it the most and probably would want to hear it the most. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to this conversation. It really started in my childhood. Like many people, I grew up with a dog who I loved. And I was also somebody who was a very sensitive child. Like most people, I would never, willingly support harm to animals, especially when that harm was so intensive and so completely unnecessary, right? But I also grew up eating meat and eggs and dairy for most of my life. And over the course of so many years and so many meals, I never thought about, how I would be petting my dog with one hand. Well, like I ate a pork chop with the other, a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as conscious and sentient and intelligent as my dog. But all of that changed. And I should also say that I came from a family that was also very conscious about social injustices, and wanting to promote compassion and justice in the world. So this is a bit of the backdrop. And then one day when I was 23 years old, I ate a contaminated hamburger and from a restaurant I had been in, and I wound up in the hospital on intravenous antibiotics. And I was just so incredibly sick that I became a vegetarian basically by accident, right? There wasn't any sort of conscious decision I made to stop eating meat. It was more like, when the last thing that you eat is you just get so sick from, you're just disgusted by it. You just don't want to eat it anymore. So I had to learn, how to cook for myself. And this was in 89. I was 23 years old. It was in 1989. So there was no real the internet then. And so I was learning about, what to eat and how to cook for myself, how to be a, vegetarian. And this information, this search essentially led me to information about animal agriculture. And then what I learned, it just shocked and horrified me. I just could not believe the extent of the suffering to the animals, to the environment, to human health. I became vegan shortly thereafter, after learning about egg and dairy production, which are arguably the most brutal of all of the industries. So I was shocked and I was horrified. But what shocked me even more than what I was learning about was that nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. Their response was always something like, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal. Or they'd call me like a radical vegan hippie propagandist. And, these were my friends and my family members. These were compassionate people, many of whom were actually very sensitive people like I was. And I just became really curious about what could cause caring people, and rational people to just, stop essentially thinking and feeling and shut down the conversation when it came to their, to eating animals, like what was going on. And so this led me to do my research, and I studied the psychology broadly, my doctoral research in psychology. I studied the psychology of violence and nonviolence. I really wanted to understand basically how, when we look at the violence in the world in general, whether it's violence toward humans or violence toward animals, we can see that, atrocities throughout human history and, and everyday violence, it's largely enabled, by a populace, because a populace turns away from a reality that they feel that they can't face, right? And when we look at the transformation of these atrocities, they have generally been transformed because a group of people chooses to bear witness to them and encourages others to bear witness as well. So I really wanted to know, what is it that makes us turn away? What is the psychology? What's going on? And how can we work to change this? And so this was what led me to do my work on the psychology of eating animals. And I really looked at the psychological mechanisms that really causes us to shut down our minds and hearts, or cause us to shut down our minds and hearts. And then I expanded that research over the years to be, to include the psychology of oppression, more broadly. And so, I don't need to get into any details of that, but that was what really brought me to the work, what led me to the work that I do today. And, and to what we're going to be talking about today, which is the paradox of how it's the sensitive people in the world who are often the most deeply affected by injustices and by harm to humans and to animals. And it's also those of us who are most sensitive who are in some ways most likely to turn away because it's so painful for us. We're more easily dysregulated. And, dysregulation, for people who aren't familiar with that term, is it's the nervous system being out of balance. So when you're dysregulated, it means your nervous system is out of balance. You're basically in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. And you could be mildly dysregulated, or you could be extremely dysregulated, which means to be flooded. And people typically feel unsafe when they feel dysregulated. So if you're a sensitive person and you know that witnessing violence causes you to be dysregulated, you're going to be more likely to avoid that, and I'm not just talking about, witnessing graphic imagery, which I don't advocate that people do if they can avoid doing that. I'm talking about just even becoming aware of a problem. For many of us who are sensitive, the world is just not set up for sensitive people, as I'm sure listeners know very well. And there's a tendency to become increasingly self-protective because, you turn on your computer, you walk out the door, you have no idea what you're going to be encountering. And it's not easy being a sensitive person in an insensitive world. So a lot of times, we also may turn away because we feel helpless, right? And nobody wants to feel helpless, but for a sensitive person, feeling helpless can be even more painful, right? Because we feel everything so deeply. And sensitive people tend to also be conscientious, like, as you said, really caring. We care so deeply, not just about what's happening in the world, but about our own impact on others.
Are there any other reasons why we might be avoiding and feeling anxious about exposure to challenging situations?
Avoidance is a strategy, right? It's a coping mechanism that we use when we're sensitive, to deal with it in a world that's not sensitive. We might also avoid witnessing violence. And when I say witnessing violence, again, I just want to reiterate this. I'm not suggesting that anybody needs to actually look at graphic imagery and take in details of violence that can be really triggering and even traumatizing. And I think this is a misconception. We can talk about this more later, that we have to like absorb ourselves, absorb the issue and really understand it and really see, how gruesome it is in order to take action. And that's just not true. Like, we can keep quite a distance from, the actual violence and still be quite impactful in helping to end it. We might avoid as well, becoming aware of problems in the world, or witnessing, quote unquote violence, because we might worry that we'll have to navigate like difficult interpersonal conflicts and possibly lose important connections with others if we learn about issues, right? So again, going back to my work on animal protection, sometimes people will say like, oh my God, well, if I learn enough about what's happening to the animals who are turned into food, it's going to make me want to stop eating animals. And if I stop eating these animals, meat, eggs, and dairy, well, what kinds of family feuds will I have to contend with, Or they might worry, like, how will I be able to maintain respect for the people in my life who then don't share my values? And these fears are not unfounded. They make a lot of sense. And they are something that can be managed with the right tools, right? They can be significantly mitigated simply by building relational and communication skills. And we have lots of resources on that. Sometimes people worry, they avoid taking in information about violence because they worry about feeling overwhelmed and despairing, right? So it's like, oh, if I really allow myself to access the enormity of something like climate change, which we know we're not going to fix right away, if at all, how can I live with that? And again, it makes sense to avoid, taking in information when you're so worried about feeling helpless and overwhelmed. Again, also there are great resources for helping people to build the kind of resilience necessary so that you can be aware enough and not be consumed by or overwhelmed by that awareness, right? So, and again, so herein lies the paradox, as we've been talking about, being a sensitive person in a violent world, right? Our sensitivity compels us to want to end the suffering, and it also compels us to turn away from that suffering, right? So we therefore end up morally and, emotionally paralyzed, right? So on some level, we all know that our inaction makes us complicit in the problem. And I'm not saying this in a blaming way. It just means that we're not, if we're not taking action, we're not helping to end it, and we're probably contributing to it, but it also leaves us feeling powerless to do anything about it. But the good news is that, like, we really don't have to choose between protecting ourselves and protecting others. With awareness, we can learn how to stay safe and also help create a better world in the process.
Well, I think that is a wonderful message, Melanie, and particularly in that article that you have recently contributed to Psychology Today. I'm just wondering if you could touch on some of those key points from your article.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really, when we bear witness, right? When we open ourselves up to information in a way that enables us to stay psychologically and emotionally safe, this enables us to shift from being passive bystanders, right, to becoming active agents of change. And so, one thing I do want to mention is that I'm not saying that, we're going to be able to avoid being uncomfortable. Like, discomfort is normal, natural, and necessary, actually, for a healthy life and for building resilience. I am saying that we can learn to bear witness without feeling unsafe and getting dysregulated and causing harm to ourselves in the process. So one thing is to not over witness, right? You don't need to constantly witness or be, as I said before, be aware of like the details of an injustice in order to help end it. Basically, we only need to be informed enough to know that something isn't in alignment with our values, right? And to know what actions we can take to counter it. A lot of times we assume that if I don't know everything, then I can't do anything. And this kind of all or nothing thinking is what keeps a lot of us feeling like trapped in, like, unable to take any action. We also need to witness ourselves while witnessing others, right? So if you're like taking in, you're reading or learning information about, a war, about poverty, about animal exploitation, pay attention to yourself. In particular, pay attention to your state of dysregulation. You're going to feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's where learning often happens. That's where growth happens. That's where we build resilience from. It's okay. If you notice that you're starting to feel dysregulated and increasingly dysregulated, then give yourself permission to stop witnessing. Protecting your own emotional boundaries is really essential for witnessing safely, and make a commitment to yourself that you're not going to put yourself in a situation where you force yourself to stay in, that you force yourself to stay in when you start feeling unsafe. And just knowing that you can trust yourself to give yourself permission to step back from a situation can go a long way. Often it's not even the witnessing that's the problem. It's that so many of us feel, because we're so conscientious, we want to do the right thing and be a quote unquote good person, we don't give ourselves permission to stop when it starts to really do damage to us and become painful. We feel like, okay, I've made a commitment. I've got to pay attention. I've got to keep doing this. I've got to keep learning. We need to also learn to self-regulate, right? So self-regulation is bringing yourself into a state of balance, bringing your nervous system back into a state of balance. And when you know how to self-regulate, you'll be less worried about getting dysregulated in the process, and you'll be better able to cope when you are dysregulated. And we can talk about this more later, but really, there's a way of sort of like determining or identifying your own dysregulation signature, essentially. And we can talk about that a little bit later. And once you can do that, you're in a better position to help keep yourself from getting too dysregulated and coming back into balance when you need to. Another tip is to just learn about high sensitivity, which I think a lot of people here in the community already do, but really learn about high sensitivity. What is it? So you can understand yourself and practice the self-care necessary for building resilience. And again, a lot of this comes down to giving ourselves permission, to taking care of ourselves, to staying regulated, and to staying safe. And finally, just appreciate that your sensitivity, it's not a weakness, it's a strength. The emotions that come up when we become aware of some of the things that are happening in the world, these are emotions of sadness and fear and grief. These are appropriate and courageous responses to violence and injustice. Much more concerning is the widespread apathy that enables these problems, right? The world needs more sensitivity, not less.
Well, thank you, Melanie. And those tips are really very positive and constructive for people. And I think there'll be a lot of people listening to this that really resonate with what you're saying and can go away with a lot of hope, I think, from what we're sharing here today, which is wonderful. And as you were talking there, Melanie, I'm just thinking about all of these strategies we have for self-regulation and how we can build our resilience and coping skills in that way. And I guess if we want to look at a particular topic or learn more about an injustice that we feel is happening, we're a little bit prepared, at least I think, for reading things that are going to be challenging and for seeing things that are going to be challenging to see. And as you've been saying, we don't need to overly absorb that, and we don't have to understand absolutely everything about it and witness things to the nth degree to be able to act and do things in a positive way. But I guess that's quite different from when we come across things quite unexpectedly. And I think this is what people do find very triggering, because if all of a sudden we've opened our online accounts, or we've turned on the TV, or we're just reading a magazine or anything, and we're not prepared for what we encounter, what would be some strategies there that you might think might help people cope with that?
Yeah, and this is a problem in how, media communicates, and, and many advocates actually communicate as well, using these like shock tactics, and sometimes these shock tactics are used, using like just throwing violence in our faces, just throwing it out there with like no trigger warnings, giving people no preparation. Sometimes that's done, because that's what sells, and it's a way of pulling people in and getting people to pay attention. Very often it's done, certainly when it comes to people who are advocating for, justice and compassion. People do this because the advocates do this because they feel they have to, in order to break through this like fortress of collective denial that's out in the world. They have to make the invisible visible. So it's coming from a good place, and it's nevertheless often creating the opposite outcomes of what advocates might want. And ideally, we always give consent to bear witness to something. I always advise that when somebody is advocating justice in any form, not to shock people with graphic imagery, because that can, number one, create more defensiveness in the people that they're reaching out to. And it also creates, harm in the people they're reaching out to. Sometimes it can be, as we've said, extremely dysregulating. And, this information is out there. And as you say, we cannot avoid being exposed to all distressing information, right? But that's also okay. I mean, we are sensitive, but we're not fragile necessarily. So a glimpse here and there is not going to take us down. I think a big part of, there are two sort of tips that I would give here. And one of them I already mentioned, which is to give yourself permission to stop. Like once you start, give yourself permission to stop. Don't say, for example, oh, I feel so guilty. Now that I've seen what's happening, I probably should learn more about this. Or, oh my God, turning from sort of like one screen to another, and then the other screen might have something popping up as well. Tip number 2 is to slow down in terms of our consumption of media. When we learn how to self-regulate more effectively, these occasional glimpses of shocking imagery that we didn't seek out are going to be easier to handle, because we're going to have more control over our own nervous systems. And we can talk more about self-regulation later. I would also say that, we need to slow down, like to consume media more slowly, right? A lot of us today are skimming and scrolling really quickly. So we're missing warning signs that are out there, right? So if you just open up your feed and your just eyes are wide open and things pop up in front of you, that's a problem. If you open up your feed and you're kind of like glancing at it to make sure, like protecting yourself, putting some blinders on before you jump right into reading it, you're more likely to catch just potentially distressing material, something that's alluding to it, I should say, before it jumps out at you. So consume media more slowly, and then you're more prepared for it. But no, you're not going to be able to avoid everything. And it's really then it's about self-regulation and having, really good psychological and emotional health hygiene, mental health hygiene. When we're taking good care of ourselves, and when we're resilient enough, we are able to manage quite a bit of material that we would otherwise be really triggered by.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Melanie, that you've made there, that we are more resilient than we give ourselves credit for if we practice our self-care, which is, of course, essential for people who are highly sensitive. And I know myself personally that I've always been very triggered and very emotionally distressed if I have seen injustices and cruelty towards animals, and those images I've found very distressing. But I think as I've gotten older and I have become more resilient to things, and that is because I have practiced some of those self-care things that you've mentioned, I've realized the real importance of creating awareness and the necessity of some of these things being documented and reported and actually shown on our television screens and media. And because as awful as it is to see these things, it can create significant change. And as sensitive people, of course, that is what we are wanting to see. And one example I can think of is our consumption of eggs here in Australia. And as a nation, we are consuming less and less cage eggs than ever before. And that is a direct result of an awareness to animal welfare because people have been quite appalled at some of the things that they have seen. And without bearing some kind of witness to these things, people just, they don't know what you don't know. So I'm just wondering, Melanie, if there's ways like consumption habits. Are there things like that that we can do to offer our support without having to over-witness distress in the media and upsetting scenes like that?
Yeah, that is such a great question and such a great example that you use as well. It's this balance we're talking about, right? That you have to make the invisible visible, or people don't really know what's going on, even though, most people know that the meat on their plate did not get there in a way that would be, especially sensitive people, that they would be even remotely comfortable with, right? But you don't know what you don't know. And so, it's very, very well said what you said. I think, as I said earlier, it's really important to appreciate that you don't have to know everything to do something, right? You can learn slowly. You can learn from websites and books that are careful in their communication. We really need to get away from this all or nothing mindset. So, you asked for an example around consumption. And, especially for people who are listening, who are sensitive and really care about animals, and a lot of sensitive people are very sensitive to animal cruelty and animal suffering, and very, very much care about animal welfare and well-being. And so it's really, we really need to get away from this all or nothing mindset. For example, a lot of times we think either I'm vegan and I'm part of the solution, or I'm not vegan and I'm part of the problem. And that's all there is to it, right? But we're, this cause, which is like ending harm to animals, it needs all the help it can get. And farming, like animal agribusiness, is like the number one form of animal exploitation in the world throughout history. I mean, more farmed animals are slaughtered in a single day than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. I mean, it's just incredible. And we don't have to be all or nothing about it. I often suggest that people try to be as vegan as possible, right? And that means, what is possible for you? Reducing your consumption at each meal. Reduction can go a long way. There's a big difference between eating, a non-vegan diet 100% of the time and eating a non-vegan diet 25% of the time. So just commit to being as vegan as possible and reducing, right? And reducing is actually the best, even more effective in terms of helping animals, more effective than switching the type of food that's consumed. So, cage-free, no question, it's like better than, caged eggs, and no eggs are better than caged eggs, right? Because there's a lot of harm involved in cage-free eggs, right? In that. So whatever works for you, right? Reduce to the degree that you're able to. You can become what I call a vegan ally, right? You can use your influence to promote the cause and to promote compassion for animals without being fully vegan yourself. So a perfect example is like this interview, right? You're not a vegan. Probably most people in the community listening are not vegan. And nevertheless, we're having a conversation that is going to really help people who genuinely care about their impact on animals make choices that really go far in helping promote compassion for animals. So, some of the people who do the most for animals, are not vegan. So there are all these different ways that people can actually get involved, and you have to get involved in a way, whether it's, we're talking about helping animals or helping humans or helping the environment, in a way that really honors your sensitivity, right? So you might not do direct action rescue work in a war zone, or go to environmental rallies, or you might not become an undercover investigator in factory farms, but you can do things like support groups. You're in Australia, Animals Australia. They're probably the reason that, you've learned so much about the plight of farmed animals. You can aid and support groups who are doing this incredibly important work and who could never do it without the support of people providing donations. You can, use your influence. If you're a writer, write about the issue. There are so many ways to be able to support a cause, and to really make a difference in the world without, having to get right down there in the trenches. And that matters a lot.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Melanie, because I was thinking of a time I used to be a wildlife carer. The stage sometimes that things were at was difficult, and you personally knew that you could do the best you could, but it wasn't going to change the end result. And if there wasn't veterinary care available, which is often not accessible where I am either, I found that was quite overwhelming to deal with, even though I was very much trying to get in there and care and offer whatever support I could. I found that there were, I guess, probably more gentle ways for my sensitive system that I could offer help, rather, as you said, than actually being in the trenches and doing it yourself, because I was trying to learn about it all. I was trying to give of my time. I was trying to, take phone calls and do all of this. And I found I just couldn't do it in the way I wanted to because of a number of factors there. So I found that personally difficult to have to give that up, because I felt all that guilt about giving it up. And I felt that I hadn't done the job properly. I was letting myself and, wildlife down and the bigger picture down. And so all the things that you've just described there, Melanie, I can definitely relate to personally when I was a carer myself. And I found other ways, as you're saying, that you can give of your support. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, and I love what you said. I think that's just a beautiful and a really perfect example. And it made me think of a couple of other things. One is that very often we feel like the direct care, the direct action is the most impactful, like saving one animal at a time, for example, like in some farm sanctuaries are, they're wonderful. And sometimes we think that that's the only way to really have an impact, or that's the biggest way to have an impact when we can see it and we're up close with the animals. Like I used to do trap and release for feral cats. And I was too sensitive for that. It was too hard for me. And I felt like, like you're saying, like somehow I wasn't going to have enough of an impact because I wasn't right up there with those animals, doing the job in the trenches. And it wasn't until later years that I learned that, the biggest impact that we're going to have and the change that needs to happen is really institutional. Yeah. So this is good news for sensitive people because it's on this level, this much bigger level of getting institutions to change, getting, meat companies, for example, to start manufacturing more vegan products, which is happening. Getting helping change laws. And I didn't realize that years later, but the good news is that on this sort of broader level, this sort of 30,000 foot level, I guess you could say, that's where the biggest impact comes from. And that's where it's actually easiest for sensitive people to do the work that we need to do because we're not so close to the violence. And I'll just quickly add one other thing when you added how people can help. And I think one thing that would go a long way is to really help debunk negative stereotypes of people who actually have chosen to stop eating animals and promote compassion for eating animals, because these negative stereotypes of vegans not only pathologize vegans, but they pathologize sensitive people. Like very often somebody who chooses to become vegan, particularly men, but not only, are, criticized as being, hypersensitive, animal-loving sentimentalists. And I think it's very important to really shift this perspective. So to recognize that, choosing to act in alignment with your value of compassion for others is something to be proud of, just like our sensitivity is.
Yeah, exactly, Melanie. And that leads beautifully into my next question I'm going to ask about messaging that we receive. And I think it's fair to say that organisations that are looking for public support, when they give positive and constructive messaging, I think they do just as well or even better than organisations that really have that negative focus on that fear and guilt and trying to get people to support because of those strong and intense emotions. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the type of messaging that's put out there for people.
Yeah, that's another really great question. And you're absolutely right. And I would frame positive and negative messaging in like two ways, right? Or sort of negative messaging in two ways. Negative messaging might be sort of like overly graphic imagery. And more often I would describe negative messaging as as messaging that shames and blames. Yeah. And, first I do want to acknowledge that the organizations that are doing that, are not doing that because they don't like people or because they don't care. Very often, you know, they're made up of people who have been working so hard to raise awareness and like kind of coming up against these walls of defensiveness and being pathologized by the dominant culture and, you know, all of these other issues. And they're doing what they've learned, which is what most of us have learned, which is that when we want to, you know, change somebody's mind, most of us have learned that if we just make people feel badly enough, then they're going to want to change. The research shows that actually the opposite is true, that when we communicate in a way that is shaming, we're more likely to create the opposite outcomes of what we want. And so even though most people communicate this way with the best of intentions, it nevertheless causes more problems than it solves. And I want to just quickly differentiate shame from guilt here. Guilt is actually a pro-social emotion, right? Guilt is how we feel when we do something that we think is bad or wrong. So guilt is how we feel about a behavior. We feel guilty when we think I did something bad. And people who don't feel guilt are people who don't like have remorse and therefore course correct and make changes to their problematic behaviors. Shame is not how we feel about a behavior. It's how we feel about ourselves. We feel guilty when we think I did something bad. We feel shame when we think I am bad. Shame is the feeling of being less than, you know, less worthy than others, of being treated with compassion and respect, less worthy than others of occupying space on this planet. It's an incredibly debilitating and toxic and problematic emotion. I always recommend that when we're trying to raise awareness of injustices, we neither guilt nor shame, because most people feel guilty anyway once they become aware of the contradictions in their values and their behaviors. We don't have to help them along that path. And because we've all been born into this profoundly dysfunctional, relationally dysfunctional world, the vast majority of us carry around a lot of shame, and automatically our guilt morphs into shame. So as soon as we feel guilty about something, we become ashamed of it. And when people go into a state of shame, research has shown that when people feel even the threat of being shamed, let alone shame, they become dysregulated. And when we become dysregulated, we automatically have less access to our executive functioning, our rational capacities, faculties, and we're all automatically less connected to our empathy. So when we even threaten shame, basically people shut down to our message. So it's very important not to communicate that way. And nevertheless, a lot of media does communicate that way. Sometimes it's because of advocates who just don't know better. Sometimes it's because that's what sells. You know, media is not tailored to the needs of sensitive people. It doesn't have trigger warnings. They use shock tactics and, you know, shaming and blaming. And, you know, and that's what sells. I mean, the algorithm encourage this kind of communication that is, you know, inspires anger, fear, and dysregulation and moral outrage.
Yeah, I think there's some excellent points there you've made. Melanie, I'm glad that you took the time to just explain those emotions for us, because that gives us a background of understanding there. And as you've mentioned, we've talked quite a bit about self-regulation strategies for adults. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions there for helping parents when their children are confronted with distressing media, because this in itself can be a significant source of stress for sensitive people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming that like most listeners here are already doing a lot to protect their children from being confronted with distressing media, because they're aware of you know, sensitivity and concerned about this issue already, and of the need to protect boundaries. I guess, you know, the couple of things I could add here, you know, is to remember to differentiate between discomfort and unsafety, right? Like, because children might become uncomfortable, they might even become distressed. But there are certain types of media that might be distressing and not really problematic for children to be exposed to and to be witnessed, right? So, there's gratuitous violence, which is a problem, celebratory violence, which is a problem, but then there's the inevitable exposure to violence. Sometimes it's news clips of a war, for instance. Children are going to be passing homeless people on the street and seeing, like, they are aware, they're on social media, they're out in the world, they do know what's going on. They do know that there is unfairness and pain and suffering in the world, and they will be exposed to some distressing media. And so the most important thing is to, number one, talk about them, about what they see or have seen, and not necessarily pathologize their suffering. And, it makes sense. It's great. The fact that you feel this, how do you feel? What are your feelings? Anger, anger is a healthy emotional response to witnessing injustice. That's great. It's a sign that, your moral compass is working, and you can explain that to them, that it makes sense to be angry. You can talk to them, try to understand what they understand and what needs explaining to them. And, when it comes to, violence, a lot of times the biggest trigger is feeling helpless to do anything about it and terrified that it's out there and I can do, and this is never going to end. And, there's, I know a lot of young children who are actually proud activists, who have activist parents who have raised them to be activists themselves. And there's a really excellent article by Caroline Paul in TED Ideas, and I'll share the link if you're, for listeners. She writes about children activists, and she says that the protection that we want for young kids comes not by, I'm quoting her, ignoring a social justice issue, but by assuring kids that we can explain it, even if we can't yet remedy it. And it's vital, she says, to go one step further. We have to teach kids how to respond with tactics that range from volunteering and raising money to boycotting and marching. These civic engagements not only empower, but they can foster that happy-go-lucky spirit that we might be we can, feel like is missing. So she says, even if you believe you've kept your child from directly experiencing, witnessing violence, the internet has certainly breached your fortress walls. And keeping activism out of kids' reach doesn't protect kids, it shortchanges them by under-preparing them for life. And I thought that was like so beautifully written. And anyway, she gives some other, some good tips in the article. So I'll share that with you for listeners.
Well, thank you, Melanie. That's such an empowering message, I think, for parents, because we are obviously distressed if we don't feel we are equipped to help our children when they're confronted and challenged with these things. So these are all really proactive tools that we can help ourselves with as parents, and also help our children with as well. So that will be a very valuable article for people to read. And I know that it is probably wishful thinking, but is there anything that we can be actively doing to bring about more constructive changes to the messaging in our media and what it is that we're actually seeing? Can we change that a little bit to be more proactive and positive, and I guess bring in some of those points that you've just mentioned there?
I mean, I think one thing we can do is to stop being bystanders by, liking and sharing, or even just allowing violent or shaming information to live on our feeds and our sites, because we're without a platform, right? This information, wouldn't get hold. And so the more, a lot of times people just assume like, okay, I haven't written the comment, they're just not paying close attention. But if all of us started withholding our support for this kind of problematic communication, it would take a lot of people to do that, but this is a step, right? To really not be a bystander to what, we could just call toxic communication, essentially. Don't allow it on your feed, don't pass it along, don't, and even people, just taking away the more overt violence. Shaming is a form of violence, and it's watering the seeds of the very sort of toxic emotions within us that causes us to, some people anyway, to be more likely to support violence. So don't be a bystander on your social media. I mean, to some degree, I don't think it can hurt to write into social media sites to voice your opinion about triggering its disturbing shock tactics and information, and ask for trigger warnings, and communicate how this has impacted you. So raise your voice. I think we just, in general, we need more sensitive people in positions of leadership. We need more sensitive people in positions of power. We really need to be talking. It's great today. Like, I remember when I discovered I was a highly sensitive person, and I think it was back in the 90s after reading Elaine Aron's book. It was so life-changing for me. And we've come such a long way as a community, about raising awareness of high sensitivity. And I think we need to raise further awareness and really just hopefully, I hope that we can get to the point where our community has enough support, gravitas, whatever it may be, so that we can start really advocating for accommodations for sensitive people, the way accommodations are made for people who have other types of differences in the world, so that we're not forced to be exposed to things that are really harmful for us. And in so doing, we'll help create a better world for everybody, because what we need is actually good for most people in the world.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Melanie, because it is so true. Because, and I don't know how many times I've come across that message for people who would not relate to being highly sensitive, but they so much appreciate the work that people do, and what we're enlightening, I guess, and bringing to the world. And as you said, it helps everyone, not just sensitive people. So it does make things a lot better for the whole. And I think if we can focus on that and take small steps that are manageable for us, I think we'll go a long way to creating that change we're looking for. So I think you've explained things beautifully today, Melanie, and I'm so glad that we've had this conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights. It's been a difficult but a really important topic, I think, to discuss. So if people would like to learn more about you and the work that you do, what would be the best way for them to connect?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to thank you and everybody in the community who's tuning in. This is just personally very meaningful for me to have this conversation with you. Well, first of all, you're just so wonderful and easy to talk to. This is the beauty of like communicating with highly sensitive people. And it's just been lovely and a really wonderful, important conversation for me personally, and I think, for us to be having. So, people who would like to learn more, they can come to melaniejoy.org. I also have a website for my organization, carnism.org, for people who would like to learn more about compassionate food choices there. Listeners can also download. I've one of the books that I've written is called Getting Relationships Right. And I wrote this as a one-stop guide to building what I call relational literacy, which is the understanding of an ability to practice healthy ways of relating, which is very, very important. Like, when we're more relationally literate, it helps us just to be more skillful as we navigate our relationships with everybody in our lives, and reduces dysregulation and stress a lot. And when I say everybody, I'm also talking about our relationship with ourselves, and that includes our relationships with other animals. So people can download chapter 1 of Getting Relationships Right for free. And it's at melaniejoy.org/books.
Well, thank you, Melanie, and I will definitely be making that download and reading that chapter, because I think it will be very insightful for everyone. So we'll make sure that we put those resources in the summary notes and the show notes as well. So thank you so much, Melanie, and thank you everyone for joining in today. And remember, if you'd like to be a part of our nurturing community, you can join us at sensitivecommunity.com. I'm Andrea Weber, and if you'd like to learn more about the work that I do, please be sure to visit expansivehappiness.com. Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Andrea.